Okay, so here I am at part two of this lecture on women in war in Vietnam. And we'll find when we come to the women combat veterans of the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that while things are changing, they're still pretty dreadful. And so here I'm talking. This part two is women in combat. When I was a kid, it was a sort of a familiar thing to hear. You didn't hear it that much. Sort of by the time the 70s were over, people had stopped saying it. By the time the early 70s, but in the 60s, I remember hearing your mother wears army boots was an insult against your mother. Nobody at my school anyway. People were kind of was a middle class school full of white kids. I mean, there was people were like, oh, it's funny. The worst thing that was going to happen to you when somebody beat you up is that they're going to break your glasses. I speak from experience. But nobody really understood what that meant. But what your mother wears army boots really means is that your mother was so ugly that she couldn't be distinguished from a man and could be drafted, and therefore wore army boots. So there was this claim that women in the army were problematic, even nurses, which is why there were more male nurses in the field. Because women were not allowed to go out. They were not permitted to go out in the field. You couldn't send a woman out in the field. It was legal. There weren't any female nurses that went into the field. Male nurses who went out into the field weren't called nurses, right? They were called medics. Well, that's partly because they weren't trained as nurses. They were given minimal medical education, and then exposed to some training in the States, and then they were sent overseas, and they were trained pretty much on the job. And this was the same system that had worked during World War II. Now, undoubtedly, lots of people's lives were helped, if not saved, by medics who provided frontline combat medicine, and then the men were evacuated to one of these surgical hospitals where there was a triage, and then nurses would have looked at them and doctors and so on. But Van Deventer says on page 105, and this is something which we are going to see again and again and again, and it really hasn't finished. I was always bothered by the attitudes of some people who believe that women in the military are either whores or lesbians. And this is really still true, still operating now. She was there in 1970, so 50 years later. This perception at the moment, we could say, we could say we're at the very depths of this right at the moment. One can hope that it will improve. The problem is that a nurse, or really any woman in a war zone, unless she's a helpless civilian, which is a much popularized Hollywood figure, disrupts men's understanding of gender and gender roles. So the problem has to be resolved by men, and one of the ways they do that is that they make movies that reinstate women as helpless beings who need men to save them and who are sexualized and so on. And so here's a little clip that will give you an indication that maybe things are changing. Okay, so here you go.
So Chuck got the promotion. Oh my God, that is so great. Nick. I'm so excited we can finally put the addition on the kitchen. Oh shoot, not again. Ugh. I should wear a raincoat. You know what? Wait. Can you hold it for a second?
What? No.
No, please, really.
I'd
It's all
rather
over the
not.
applique.
Oh, no,
No, please, just... Oh. Oh. Seltzer.
Oh, she likes you.
still alive, baby?
Come on, honey. Come to Dad.
Who's your daddy now?